All right, we are into Egypt, very popular module, and probably one that you know a lot about. Um, there's a lot of work from this time, and a lot of the pieces inspire and continue to inspire, but really inspire other civilizations like the Greeks and which eventually Romans. So this work that's going to come out of here, you're going to see a lot of similarities again and again too. So I want to hit those major pieces because of those comparisons. Now, Egypt um, is not what we've always known. So I'm going to go through some misnomers here, and a lot about Egyptians is defined by death. Most of uh, their religions, their beliefs, their artwork centers around how they treat death. Um, we know a lot about their life because of their invention of hieroglyphics, which is their form of writing, which is picture writing, but also has some symbols in there as well. So we have a very specific alphabet that's formed, and not just characters narrating a story sort of thing. And papyrus is made from reeds. Probably a lot of you probably know this, but just to recap, is that these reeds are then pressed together to form like an earlier form of paper. It's not as archival as paper. It has a tendency to, of course, fall apart over time, but it is a way of easier time than things like clay that we saw in Mesopotamia with cuneiform. We know the meaning of the hieroglyphs because of the Rosetta Stone that was found by Napoleon. And this stone, like I'd mentioned before, had translated several languages, one passage of several languages on the stone. So we were able to decode what was being written by the Egyptians. Without that, honestly, it's amazing. This one specific stone, we would be lost. We would just be looking at sort of shapes and lines carved into walls and written on papyrus. So that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. Um, but we know about sort of their mummification, and if you haven't read about that, please do so. We will cover that a little bit in this chapter. You probably know a little bit about the Egyptian gods, how they're represented as half animal and half human figures. They have a lot of mythologies that explain the existence of their people through these gods, and just like the Greeks, there's a god of sort of every position, a god of the underworld, a god of the sky, of the sun, right, a god of war, right. There's that sort of structure maintains. Um, we know that with the mummification that there's a very strict ritual, uh, and which when the leader dies, they go through this process to sort of preserve the body. The body is sort of in need to be that portal to the afterlife. And so, if you haven't read about it, it's very interesting how usually an incision is made on the left side of the body, right underneath the ribs, and the major organs are taken out and put into Coptic jars. These are jars that usually have a little animal head figure on top of them and set next or set within the tomb. Uh, Most details that most people remember, if you know anything, is that whole sort of scrambling of the brain and removing it through the nostrils. That did happen. They would then pack the body with salts, with oils, and it would be wrapped again and again in sort of these linens that were made. And then within that, they were usually placed within a series of sarcophagus. Traditionally, they were wooden, and so the first sort of encasing after they were wrapped up, you would be put into a wooden coffin. Then from there, that coffin would be put into a much more elaborate gilded coffin, much that we think of with sort of the treasures. And then that coffin would be then placed in sort of another casing, which was sort of the covering, like a stone covering or something like that to protect it. So, um, but it's very interesting because with that preservation of the dead, we've seen animals that are mummified. Of course, the kings and the pharaohs were mummified, so it was definitely something of importance. Not everybody was mummified, um, but so we know that by having that ritual, then there was something very sort of sacred about that, and, and probably definitely for more elite status. But with those, we have a good snapshot of Egyptian life and times and art and understanding. However, these places have been looted over time. In fact, it was pretty common that within 48 hours after someone was buried, grave robbers came in and took the most precious of items. And of course, over time, things that didn't get looted then were then looted later on and later on. So we get a very small fraction of what Egyptian life was like, and we'll talk later about King Tutankhamun, because the most important thing about him is the fact that his tomb wasn't looted, so we get the best idea of how things would have looked, and how much more grand they would have been for pharaohs and kings that lived longer. So we're going to talk about 5 specific time periods in Egyptian history, and I want to talk about these time periods so that way we sort of start to dispel some of the myths about Egypt, and terms that have just been commonly used. So I'm going to highlight some major works, not all of it, just because there is a lot. There's some very important stuff, and I'm just going to do the best I can to skim over it. There's a lot of films that are involved, so please check out the YouTube links, and those video lists that I provided. It really is going to give you a lot better insight to what is going on. So the pre-dynastic period, this is a time where Egypt is not unified. We have Lower Egypt in the north and Upper Egypt in the south, and I put that in in this map over here, because I mean, when you think of it, if you go upriver, right, you are going up. So Upper Egypt is up the river, right? It's draining out into the Mediterranean, so it makes sense to call this Lower and this Upper Egypt, and the land of Kush, right? And that's actually even another tribe itself at this time too. But they trade with each other, they do war with each other, but you basically have two very similar peoples using the Nile as a life source, right? The Nile floods, it deposits really rich minerals across the soil, so you're able to then grow crops. Strong agriculture based communities, and of course, you have pretty consistent water, so you can live through these dry times. But the Upper Egypt, these are kings. We don't call them pharaohs, and we won't call them pharaohs for a long time. So that's one misnomer I want sort of people to get over, is that we just always call them pharaoh, right? There's let my people go and all that sort of stuff, and we've just sort of ingrained that Egyptian kings are pharaohs. No, they're kings. The Upper Egyptian king he would wear a white crown, and I call it, like, it looks like a bowling pin, but it's called the hedjet, and meaning white crown. The lower called the distret, which is a red crown and sort of has a spiral protrusion coming off of a headdress. These are the symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt. Okay, but they weren't united, and really Egypt doesn't really start being considered all of Egypt until around 3000 BCE, when King Narmer here unifies them. I'm going to show you this palette. This is the palette that was created. A lot of these palettes were first created ceremonially for shields from the sun. This one, though, being made of slate, being so heavy, right, it wouldn't make sense to have that carried above your head. Was used for grinding cosmetics, and the YouTube link there is going to give you a lot more understanding of what that means by cosmetics. But this would have been at the base of a statue, commemorating this individual, probably within their tomb, and the cosmetics that would have been ground on everything, decorating the body and such. But what we see here, right, there's that hedjet, right, that bowling pin. And here's the key, and we don't have the best detail here, but he's smiting this individual. And here, right, is we actually see the bowling pin, and in the front we had that first image of a unified Egypt. So we have a combination of those symbols. Um, and in the YouTube link, they'll show that even more. But here's that procession, right? Here's the king. And much like what we saw with the Stela of Naram Sin, right? This is another, what we could call stela, right? It's a stone slab. And we have that same idea, right? Let's make the king bigger. Let's make the common people smaller. Let's use a ground line to sort of delineate between the narratives that we're trying to tell, right? Now, in Egyptian art, we do have, some different uses of ground. It's not like they're completely even right here, right? We have three bands that are happening here, and then one band that is telling the story. This is Horus, and he sort of, which we know and is a symbol there for Upper Egypt, and all of this sort of like packed onto this front and back side, is this narrative. But I really love the comparison that we can draw between Sumerian art. So what that tells me is either one, when we create as human beings, we either start in a very similar place, or two, and probably the most obvious, is that people have traveled from Mesopotamia or to Mesopotamia, and they have seen these images, and they've wanted to use those images to show their own power, right? To put out their own sort of like, no, we have leaders of same stature, right? We are just as powerful. We can rule and command. And so that's more or less what I think is going on with that. But this is a very important piece that shows us historically how this civilization came together. Now, you have to talk about architecture probably as quickly as possible when you talk about Egypt, because that's really what they are most known for. But the first pyramids, and this is going to link back to Mesopotamia as well, are stepped pyramids called mastaba. Okay, so please, that's going to be on the quiz. And mastaba is the Egyptian early form of a step pyramid. Okay, these mastabas you can still see next to the Great Pyramids, but they have that tiered structure. Now they don't have the ramp going up the side like we think of with a ziggurat. So there's some very different architectural features. But we can see where we have this four-sided pyramid and what it will become, right? But the earliest ones are the mastaba. Okay. Now, Old Kingdom, which is still like, if Egypt comes around at 3000 BC, here we are 425 years later, and we have this Old Kingdom, this next phase of Egyptian civilization. And its highlight is the architecture, specifically the Great Pyramids. Now, you would think in the advancement of a civilization, the thing that would have been known for the most is what would maybe have been around after they've been around for a very, very long time. Well, 400 years is a long time. Egypt's going to last for another 1200 years. And you would think that, wow, these would maybe be a little bit later on, a little bit earlier in dating to us, but they're not. And I find that to be fascinating. This is sort of a golden age for Egypt. Now, keep in mind, yes, they're unified, but we're still not using the term pharaoh yet. So even in Old Kingdom, we're still using the word king. And if you haven't read anything on mummification yet, from just a little bit I told you, please do so, because it'll make a whole lot more sense on why things are built the way they were built. And especially with the pyramids of Giza, there's a lot of specifics to their orientation, being to celestial bodies, where they were placed, why they were placed there. All of that has to do with sort of the rise to dead. But these are, as you can imagine, sort of like portals, right? They're pointing to the sun, right? The idea that if you can imagine the sun setting on top of this on that point, it's almost like, yeah, if there's a king or a dead person inside there, yeah, they're ascending, right? You can almost imagine this magical moment. But the YouTube gives a great short animation on the pyramids and really what's happening. Now the Sphinx, which is also included there, is more than likely a portrait of a dead king. We do not know if the face was specifically defaced for a reason. Um, Something I'll mention again is that a lot of time noses are broken off of sculptures purposely to, in ways like ceremonial, like take their power. Like if a ruler and their face was intact, and let's say like you're, in your raiding party, you go and you conquer, you don't want that ruler to be, remember, you're going to show them as weaker because you defeated them. So they would a lot of times knock the noses off. And that's maybe what happened with the Sphinx. Not exactly sure. But we know that a lot of times, whether it's Egyptian or Greek or even Roman, we see it again in, you'll see it through every single one of these chapters, the idea of defacement in order to show sort of like, I'm better than you, more powerful than you, I've defeated you, right? And sort of defaced you even in death. So some really cool stuff though on the pyramids, and there's more YouTube links because there's a lot. You could spend probably an entire semester just studying those. But I really want to sort of focus on some other pieces as well, as this is the highlight for the Old Kingdom. Now, art is in its, we'll say, other forms, both a sculpture and two-dimensional, is being created. The main forms are of what we think of like the hieroglyph paintings and then relief carvings. So we have these murals that are being decorated, being put everywhere, and then the relief carvings. So what's really important about the arts is that we still see this definitive ground line that's going to go through all of those hieroglyphs, but the hieroglyphs themselves, what's just super fascinating about them when you think of those depictions on the wall is that there is a grid structure that was developed by Egyptians for their art, and that grid structure did not change. So for over 1,000 years of them creating these hieroglyphs and these murals, the units of measure never changed. And so what I mean by that is that imagine a wall, and you're an artist and you're about to go paint, right? You're told that you're going to dedicate this to this king, and that king is this is gonna be a battle scene, let's say. Well, you would first grid off in these standard units of measure, and using those standard units, you would then start to place in the certain figures. We know that a hand is 1.5 grid squares long. The foot is 2 squares long. And if you're a king, you're so many squares high. And if you're a peasant, you're so many squares high. All of that stayed the same for over 1,000 years. That's, to me, insane. I mean, when we think of ourselves as Western culture, we think of like, oh, I want to express myself. I want to draw what I want to draw. Well, that would not have happened. You are a crafts person making what you're told to this standard unit, and it never changed. And that was sort of their idealized perfection. This is how they went about beautifying. And that's why we see that Egyptian style, right? That side pose, why we see that continued throughout their entire height of civilization, is because that's what to them was beautiful. But that grid system was set, and it's pretty amazing. So they use this technique called fresco secco, which is painting on dry fresco or dry plaster. And so you'd have a wall, and then you'd coat it with plaster, and then you'd let that dry. Now the problem with that is that the pigment, when you paint on it, since it's already a dry surface, that pigment's not soaking into the plaster. It's not going to be until the Renaissance where we start to see artists painting on wet plaster. So that way that pigment dries into the plaster and is preserved a lot longer. So because of this technique, we see a lot of sort of like fading, chipping, falling away, because it's just not the most archival. All right. So to give you a better idea about what I've been just talking about is here's that grid system. And we know this existed because they have found unfinished murals. It's almost like people just like packed up and left that still had visible chalk lines of this grid system on it. And so they could compare that grid to earlier pieces and find it's still the same, right? So here's that grid, right? And the hands would always be X amount long, right? The feet would always be X amount long. And to do that, they needed to have it more in a two-dimensional sort of pose than a three-dimensional. Now, yes, the shoulders are turned towards us, but that's not foreshortening in this case because it's still a flattening, right? These are definite flattening of space. They are not trying to give us a greater illusion of space at all. So now you have that whole like why they walk like an Egyptian thing. Now, some of the most important pieces is that really inspire the Greeks are these. This is the same piece here, but we have an understanding of one if the king uh, is being depicted with his wife. That shows you sort of this. Oh, there must be something about how we understand or how they see women's roles in this. This is not just about the king, right? There's still this individual next to him. And they're given more of an identity, right? We look at the face, and there's probably a strong likeness. It's not completely stylized that everybody's going to look a certain way. So we have a little bit of portraiture starting to come about. We don't exactly know if that's completely true, just because we have no other representations of this individual to say, oh yeah, that's what they look like. But what was very interesting is that we're trying to come out of the stone, right? We're starting to take that true step forward. Now, in doing so, we see that they can't fully do that because if you remove this stone, um, it would probably be way too fragile. It'd lose its balance and or put too much stress on like the knee and the leg joint, and that would probably break off. So it's still too heavy. So we have this back bracing that's going on. We're not going to see the freeing from stone until we move into Greece, but this step forward, those arms, everything is still very stiff, right? It's not like there's a very relaxed pose, but they're starting to create things of details for clothing, right? Look how the body has been sort of polished on both individuals, right? To give sort of a roundness, right? There's some anatomy that seems somewhat correct there. Not completely, but it's somewhat. And so there's an observation of sort of trying to perfect the human form, right? So we're seeing beauty continue to be expressed. Now, by the time we get to the Middle Kingdom, we actually do have the sculptures that have a very realistic features to them, right? So when we look at here, right, we can see that, like, all right, so the brow and things need to be a little bit bigger. And the eyes themselves, though, we start to see, well, yeah, they have that lid and such. But when we go here, we actually have a portrait, right? We actually have what we know to be the individual. And that's why there's probably more defacement going on. I talked earlier about the breaking of noses. So to do that to a very specific individual instead of a generalized human being, it would make more sense because of that, removing of their power. So we see these inside of tombs, cut into the stone, right, being carved, and and with that, we're also seeing some other sort of like architectural elements. I mentioned there are things like the columns and such, and we'll look at those. Now, there's also this misnomer that we always have had pyramids. The Egyptians just used pyramids, and there's in our mind there's like just pyramids all over the place. Well, that's not true because of the resources and the time it makes to make those. So as we move into the Middle Kingdom and move from the Old to the Middle Kingdom, we have really being carved directly into these cliff walls. Now, this is usually sandstone, so it's a little bit easier to carve into. It still takes some tools, right? So that tells us that there's some technologies, but it's not like they needed to use dynamite and like blow things out or something like that. They were able to just methodically remove that material. But with there, right, when we start adding these sort of pillars, yeah, because you needed support, but they can begin to decorate them, begin to stylize them. But it gives us a whole new way of viewing architecture. We're not about the four-sided pyramids anymore. We're about a little bit more function, but that function and form mixed together eventually lead us to a new style. So these are burial chambers. They're very simple. Right now they'd have like metal gates sort of block these off, but you'd be able to enter, and then from there go through a doorway, and inside there would be a chamber. So it makes it very easy for looting. So these are just a lot of sort of like empty shells. Now in the New Kingdom, we finally use the term pharaoh. Okay, and with that, we're going to combine and sort of come back to maybe a little bit of like, well, what was great about the pyramids? Well, it was their scale, it was the grandeur, it was sort of this making of a monument, where carving away into the walls, like, well, that's fine. But we sort of combine those elements. So now we see pillars being used, but we're seeing a greater procession. We're seeing sort of this larger space, sort of complex design that is utilized in the New Kingdom for burial chambers. We see powers, especially like Hatshepsut, and she is the very first recorded king, right? Pharaoh, female. Like this is huge, right? And first in history, right? So that tells us when we go back to a slide like this, is that okay? Yeah, women must have held some power. There were definitely different ideas on the female role in society, and that is recorded here. And she's got a great story. There's a lot of course, sort of like politics behind it, but if you're interested, you can check out her life story. And she had commission built this the Deir al-Bahari temple, and this is probably the best architectural design for Egypt in this New Kingdom style. I put a link on Google Earth to this if you want to walk through and see it. So it's out there on the Moodle shell. All right. Another great commission is the Temple of Abu Simbel, and by Ramses III. This was a relief carved right into the wall. What we see now, though, maybe what makes this even more remarkable is what we see now is not the original site of where it was. This was actually several hundred yards down, closer to the river. But as the river has started to rise, they did not want to lose this. So engineers figured out how to cut this out of the stone wall and then kind of fashion a new resting place for it, but it looks pretty much the same. So it's sort of an amazing story of there. But this would have been, where you can enter and there would be a temple, not necessarily worship to the gods, but definitely used more as that, for one god in particular, usually Ra, the sun god. It's not like this is like a church. So, a little bit of difference between temples and churches. So. What's a term I want you to know that really comes about, we talk about columns, but these columns lead to something called a clerestory. And so when you look up, that's what's happening here. The clerestory is this space above the columns and usually is left open so that way you can get some light. You can imagine by putting columns so close together, because the materials are so heavy, they can't span a great distance, right? If this stone is longer, right, the chances of it just collapsing in the middle are greater. So they have lots of pillars closer together, but that closes the space and that makes it very, very dark. So you leave that roof open and now you have a clerestory. So I want you to know that, and this is an example of that. And so it's that raised roof. We'll talk more about these later, and we'll get into more of their designs and, of course, how the Greeks eventually use them. So uh, Akhenaten is and the Arar period is pretty interesting because we do see um, stylistically things change when we're talking specifically about like the sculpture and such of Egyptian art. I mean, when you look at this already, it is night and day from the last sculptures that we are looking at. Now we've taken the Egyptian style, we've added sort of an actual face or an identity to it, and here we take it even further by really looking at the not only the facial features, but imagine sort of um, like you like when I think of like graphic novels and such, you can always tell the artists who drew the graphic novel because of the way they've approached. So even if they're drawing, let's say Batman, right, there are several versions that we've seen of that character. Some with sharper lines, some with softer lines. So if I was describing this work, and I'd use a lot of elements of art to describe how sort of contrasting this is compared to these sort of pieces. These figures are rounded in the face, right? Everything's very sort of soft and removed, where this has more sharp angles to it. Um, but this is a bust of Nefertiti, and um, and this artistic sort of revolution really was short-lived, but it gives us maybe a glimpse into how a society maybe wanted to change. Maybe there was a moment where they're like, you know what, we want to do things a little bit differently. And so the artwork is reminiscent of that. And here could be a new take on idealized beauty as far as how they, you know, saw themselves. Okay. Now, King Tut, uh, I'm just going to do one slide on this, and you definitely need to check out the links and the movies that I have recommended on this. There's a lot to talk about. There's everything from the mysterious curse of King Tut that kills um, the archaeologist and several of the workers that went into it, down to the gold, the amount of wealth that came out of the tomb. Like I said before, the most important thing about King Tut to take away is that it was an untouched site. So it was preserved throughout all these years. And it's too bad that in ways it was found at that time. If it was found a little bit later, it may have even been more preserved because um, Howard Carter, who discovered it, was and I'll say this more than anything. He was more of an amateur, another one of those sort of treasure seekers a little bit. So when they found the mummy, and they pulled it out and it had this headdress on it, they wanted the headdress, right? It's gold, it's money, it's worth a lot. So they actually set fire to the mummy itself to remove it, to actually get it off of the body. So we do still have the mummy left, but it's in really horrible condition because of how they treated it. They really wanted the sort of precious stuff. They weren't interested in sort of the research and cataloging of something like the body itself. But the mummy still exists, or the body still exists, but we do have this headdress that came off of it. King Tut was very young. He died when he was 18. There's it's interesting because the images of him show him like leading battles and defeating enemies, and that never happened. Um, and and we know this never happened, but they sort of commemorate, sort of build sort of myth about him. Like that's what you're going to do to your leaders, is that during their time they were great, and that's what inside of his tomb it looks like. Um, if he was so wealthy for such a small amount, it makes us wonder, well, would somebody like a Ramses or somebody who served for a longer time have more wealth, right? It would be interesting to see that. But those are the important things that you can take away from King Tutankhamun and why he's so revered, even though in the scheme of Egyptian history, he's very much a blip on the radar. Um, and it's important to know that right around 1000 BC is when Egypt began to fall. Um, for Alexander the Great was really the first to come through and conquer them. Eventually, then the Romans. But what's more interesting is that during this time, the traditional art forms of Egyptian lived on and they were passed on through foreign rule because of the amount of knowledge that they procured, because of sort of the advancement of their society. It was a great inspiration for others to follow. So we're going to see a lot of stylistic um, uh, pieces that you'll say, oh, that looks kind of Egyptian. But yeah, it really is. So.